Okay, folks, let's start. We're still waiting some people to arrive, but hopefully they'll turn up in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this Group of 78 2024 Policy Conference on Citizens Confront the Climate Crisis. We had hoped that we could have Verna McGregor, Algonquin Anishinaabe elder, to provide welcoming remarks, but tomorrow turned out to be a better day for her, so we've had her speak to us on Saturday, tomorrow, first thing in the morning, 8:30. So if you can adjust your programs accordingly to be here for that. But in opening this event, we should still pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of the land on which we are convening this meeting. We acknowledge that their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. And we affirm the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. And we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I just wanted to make a few remarks to put the conference we're about to have in context. 3 years ago, in 2021, the theme of the Group of 78's annual policy conference was Adaptation, Building Resilience in the Climate Emergency. It was a time when not much attention was paid to the need to adapt to the reality of climate change. Indeed, Canada's National Adaptation Strategy was only launched in November 2022, a year after our conference. Is there cause and effect, do you think? Can't rule it out. Today, in Canada and around the world, governments, communities, and householders are all struggling to keep up with the demands of a warming climate, as intensifying heat domes, wildfires, and devastating floods continue to wreak more havoc and take more lives. And as we speak, a new hurricane is barreling its way through Florida and is sure to come and visit us in the next week or so. But while adaptation is urgently needed to protect us against the impacts of climate-driven disasters, it does not tackle the causes of climate crisis. So this year, we are returning to the subject of fighting the root causes, which was the focus of our 2018 conference. This fight calls for reversing the growth of greenhouse gas emissions by stopping the expansion and reducing the production and consumption of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. That is the aim of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which is a principal focus of this conference and the subject of Sephora Berman's keynote address later this morning. This is a fight that cannot be waged or won by any one country, or group of countries for that matter. It is a fight that calls for collective action by all countries. Moreover, successful collective action calls for engagement not only by national governments, but also subnational governments, civil society, the private sector, youth groups, seniors groups, Indigenous communities, faith groups, and many others. And it calls for curtailing the considerable power of the fossil fuel industry to prevent or stymie action. We are meeting at a critical point in time. This week at the UN in New York, which has been dubbed New York Climate Week, there have been intensive negotiations. There was much discussion of climate issues and how they are reflected in the Pact for the Future. There is a widespread recognition among diplomats as well as civil society of failure to reduce emissions and to reach even inadequate targets, but also a failure in governance. Tomorrow, our second keynote speaker, Kat Abreu, will address the need for civil society to build pressure for the next generation of climate plans, post-Paris Agreement, that are more ambitious and call for the finance needed to support the transition away from fossil fuels and toward energy efficiency, and particularly for developing countries. We will hear a lot more on responding to the challenge of collective climate action from our distinguished speakers and panelists and you, our audience, in the next day and a half. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in what promises to be a very exciting and timely discussion. However, as chair of the G78, I would like you to consider what it takes our organization to mount such annual policy conferences, along with several speaking events every year. We do so on a shoestring budget and mostly with volunteers. We do so at present entirely with funding from membership fees and donations. We do not have any funding from governments, which helps enable us to maintain our independence. Unfortunately, membership fees and donations have fallen. They fell significantly during the pandemic. While they have partially recovered, our current funding is inadequate to sustain the G78. Therefore, we call upon you, people at this conference, to consider joining the G78 if you are not already a member, renewing your membership if you are a member, and especially making a generous donation to the G78. You can do so online by visiting our website, or you can do so if you are here in person at the registration desk with the help of our friendly student volunteers. I remind you that we are a charitable organization and we issue receipts to donors for tax purposes. Let me also take a moment now to remember someone who helped to bring the Group of 78 into existence over 4 decades ago. We were saddened by the passing of Lois Wilson on September the 13th in Fredericton. Lois was one of the 78 prominent Canadians who in 1981 signed an open letter to the then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau to urge progressive action on Canadian foreign policy, an initiative that led to the formation of the G78. Lois remained engaged with the G78 for the rest of her life, participating in its earlier conferences, speaking at its 25th anniversary, and opening its 2021 policy conference to mark its 40th anniversary. Her many distinctions included serving as a senator from 1998 to 2002, being appointed to the Order of Canada, and authoring 10 books, among other things. Lois was a constant activist and advocate for human rights, social justice, women's rights, and peace. The Group of 78 salutes Lois Wilson as an untiring advocate for a more humane world and a lifelong inspiration. I would also like to convey our best wishes to John Stone, a member of the G78's Climate Change and Environment Working Group. John would dearly like to have been with us today, but cannot due to poor health. A distinguished climate scientist, John has generously shared his considerable wisdom with the Group of 78 and has been instrumental in shaping the G78's climate policy conferences in 2018 and 2021, as well as today's climate policy conference. Okay, so with those remarks, I'd like to ask a question. Is Adrian with us? Okay, good. So we can move on with our program. With those remarks, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Susan Tanner, Vice Chair of the G78 and Chair of the G78 Working Group on Climate Change and the Environment, which, under Susan's leadership and despite her ailing knee, has organized this year's conference. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Roy. So welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to see you here. This weekend has turned out to be a little bit of a different problem. For there's huge number of competing things happening this weekend. But it's an excellent example for us to see, I think, in that we have to struggle with our very busy lives and our families, whereas the fossil fuel companies are paid to do their lobbying and to figure out their strategies and how to delay action on climate change. So here you are. I'm so pleased, ready to look at solutions. I think I'll start today with my favorite coming-of-age story. Is this still on? Okay. It's a becoming of old age story, and my family have heard it already. I'm sorry, but there is a reason I wanted to mention it. So as I was wandering around the parking lot of the Billings Bridge Shopping Centre, looking for my car, where had I parked it? A lovely-looking older lady came up to me and put her hand on my arm and said, "Don't worry, dear. They move them all around when we're in shopping." Now, I don't know if she really was a conspiracy theorist or if she just had a really good sense of humor. But the important thing to me was that she reached out to console a stranger. And I think that is one of the big things that we really need in this coming era, with its war and climate events looming ahead of us. And so I think that is another excellent reason for why it is so important we get together and have a plan for making these changes, or ensuring they are made. All right. I was grateful to Roy for illustrating the negative side, but what I did want to say here was that we are looking for solutions. We are looking for collaborative things that we can do so that we can push the agenda. And we may have to be really creative about it. I mean, there's some wonderful things that are happening. Solar is getting cheaper. Geothermal is heating people's homes. Heat pumps are making heat much more efficient. There is rewilding agriculture in addition to regenerative agriculture. There's a lot going on. And those are the things that make it possible for us to continue without fossil fuels. And we can do it, despite the fact that they like to tell us that we can't, but we could. And in New York this week, there were some really creative things. There was a installation by Sierra Club Canada, which is much smaller than Sierra Club United States, but it was Sierra Club Canada, about victims of the flooding and the wildfires. And they had the people there who could actually talk, and they called it "Let's Save What We Love." And so obviously that's nature, but also there's only very few things that the victims could have, or the survivors I should call them, could save from their homes. It was an excellent, excellent initiative. Another thing that happened in New York just this last week was a barge rolling around, not rolling, but swimming around the port with a huge, huge billboard saying "Polluter Pay." It was very effective, especially at night, lots of lights. And of course, there were important meetings happening at Climate Week in New York, which Kat and Fiore will tell us about. But there were also meetings of many NGO groups and who were collaborating and getting to know each other and making plans as well. So we're here to explore ways to push for the climate and support each other while doing that. We need creative ideas. The head of the new president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty equated what fossil fuel companies are doing now with what owners of slaves did in the old days. Yep. Because what they're doing is entirely unethical. It harms people's lives, and they're doing it solely for profit. And they know what the issues are. So when I was thinking of that, I was thinking, we need songs. We need the songs that consoled the slaves and inspired them to continue. We need songs, we need cartoons. We need cartoons that will make us laugh instead of despair. We need cartoons that will put the fossil fuels in their place. And I'm sure that you'll come up with lots of other creative ideas of how we can work together to make this difference. So, Adrian, where is he? There he is, yay! Okay, wonderful. So now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Adrian Harewood, who will moderate a conversation between generations. We've got two excellent speakers up here at the front, but Adrian will introduce you to. But what I wanted to say a few things about Adrian, because Carleton is very lucky to have managed to hire this guy. He's extensive experience, of course, hosting All in a Day at CBC, but actually having hosted most of the other, as far as I could tell from what I was reading, most of the other programs also at CBC, and including a few other places. But the thing that I like so much about you, Adrian, is that you are a community builder. You are very generous with your time and talent to so many institutions in this community. It actually makes me want to cry. And I met Adrian when he was hosting the Big Soul Project Christmas concert, at which we earned tens of thousands of dollars for the food bank. And that is Adrian. So please come up, Adrian, and take the mic.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for that very kind and generous introduction. I feel as if you're my sister from another mister, because I lose my car every day in the parking lot. So this is something that I can certainly relate to. And I'm realizing that I'm becoming a little older as well, because I'm remembering things from when I was a teenager, which was, wow, it's almost over 40 years ago. Well, 35 years ago, about. Anyway, the event brought together 2,000 activists, community workers, and journalists from across North America to discuss the formulation of a freedom agenda that would advocate for social, economic, and environmental justice and racial equality. It was an inspiring and life-affirming few days. But for me, the most exhilarating session at the Black Radical Congress involved an on-stage conversation with some of the most prominent activists of the 1960s and 1970s. People like Kathleen Cleaver, people like Angela Davis, to struggle, but they shared stories. They commiserated eviscerated. It was a soulful, dynamic, informative, and constructive exchange. And we all left feeling nourished, feeling as if we'd been reminded of the power of providing space for intergenerational dialogue. Intergenerational dialogue. We're facing an existential crisis, the likes of which we have never confronted before as a species. It's a daunting challenge. Indeed, it can be demoralizing to recognize our predicament. Given our stark climate reality, how do we carry on? How do we move forward? How do we build community? How do we use our power to make change? How do we keep hope alive? So that's what I think today's session is about. Right? I think today's session is about building bridges between generations. It's an opportunity for us to learn from each other. It's an opportunity for us to teach each other. It's an opportunity for us to listen. It's an opportunity for us to develop empathy. It's an opportunity for us to do what the Asian American philosopher and activist Grace Lee Boggs once said. It's an opportunity for us to become more human beings. All right? It's an opportunity for us to, as Grace would say, to enlargen our humanity. All right? That's what this is, an opportunity. And so I'm very pleased that we have two individuals who have dedicated themselves to struggle, who have been part of the climate movement, and who today will be sharing some of their ideas, sharing stories, and perhaps telling us about ways in which we can chart a course into the future with hope and a sense of possibility. So I'm just going to ask Vanessa Fiore to come forward. Vanessa, as many people in this community will know, is a longtime climate activist. I think she began when she was a young girl in short pants. All right? When she was 16, I believe, you were volunteering yourself, in climate activism. So welcome, Vanessa. And also, please, yes. And also, I'd like to invite Rolly Montpellier forward. And Rolly, when he was thinking about retiring, thought he was going to be golfing. He was planning to golf, and he was planning to go fishing during his retirement. But instead, Rolly spends about 30 to 40 hours every single week devoted to this movement. He is an organizer. I don't know what kind of golf game he has right now. But we're thankful for that. We're thankful for the efforts that you've been making. So Rolly, welcome. Have a seat. So I'm going to give both of these folks a microphone.
Yes.
And I'll stay here. I can go over? Okay. Okay, sure. Super. All right.
Sit next to
Good.
each other. Does this work?
Okay.
Yes, it does.
So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
I'm the older guy here.
No, it's great to see you, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. Been thinking about this idea that we're all in the process of becoming. I've been really fortunate to have some older folks in my life, and one person who played a really, really important role for me in my formation was a woman named Irene Kahn. Now, Irene was a friend of Norman Bethune's, actually. And her father had been a friend and had worked with J.S. Woodsworth back in the day. She was the daughter of Russian immigrants who'd come to this country in the early 20th century. In the 1960s, Irene provided space for a lot of folks who were escaping the draft in the U.S. So a guy by the name of Rosie Douglas, some of you might remember that name, former president of Dominica, but he was also very much part of the Sir George Williams affair that happened in 1969 at what's now Concordia University, a kind of significant civil rights moment, I would argue, in Canadian history. Anyway, Irene was in her late 90s actually, she was in late 80s when we became very close friends. And Irene was the most active person I knew. And Irene was learning every single day, and she was building community every single day. And what she taught us was that it's always possible to be engaged, and it's always possible to learn. So I want to preface the question by starting with you, Rolly, because, you know, I began by kind of joking, you know, your golf game isn't very good. But you had a particular kind of vision of what your retirement was going to look like, right? You thought that you were going to be taking it easy, right? You'd be fishing, you'd be golfing, you'd be doing the things that you'd always wanted to do. Clearly, something changed for you. And I don't know whether you had an epiphany or what took place, what transpired. But I'm curious about your own evolution and how you came to this place that you're in right now.
Yeah. Can you hear me well? Yes. It's not something I planned. I never planned to become an activist. It's not. It just happened. And when I did retire, which was 20 years ago, 2003, I just had more time on my hands. And then, you know, you're at a point in your life when, you know, you start questioning the meaning of life. So I was having one of these adjustment periods after retirement, feeling kind of down also because retirement is a huge adjustment, especially I think for men who have been so career focused. Our identity is on that, based on that. And it's also the time when my grandchildren were born. They started coming into our lives. I have 4 grandkids. They range in age from 19 to 15. And it was one of those, epiphanies, I guess. As I was doing research and reading a lot about climate change, I remember reading The Long Emergency. Some of you probably saw that book way back then. It just dawned on me that the question that came to mind was, how in the hell did we let this happen? I mean, I was part of that generation that was at the wheel of power and government and, you know, corporate leadership and so on. So our generation had it all. And so I started asking myself, how did we not see this coming? And I think many of us will reflect on that as well, or ask ourselves that same question. I think we knew all along intuitively that things were not right. I mean, we enjoyed the good life and traveled and did all of those beautiful things. It was that one hell of a party, which lasted all these years, 50, 60 years. But now the party's over, and I mean, I don't know, after a party, there's hangovers, you have to clean up the mess. Well, that's where we're at right now. We are at that stage where, you know, benefiting from all the good life has also left us with huge problems, environmental problems. And so for me, it was when my grandchildren came along. And I remember also at that time I was doing a lot of reading, and I read this poem, the title of which by a fellow by the name of Drew Dillinger, I think it is. It was, the title of the poem was, "What Did You Do Once You Knew?" And this poem is about someone who's haunted by his grandchildren in his sleep, asking him the question, well, what did you do when you saw things unraveling and when you saw all of this environmental degradation? And once you ask yourself, once you know something is wrong like this, like what we're facing now, well, you can't unknow it. And it was a combination of those I guess, at that point in my life that just made it very, very clear what I would be doing for the rest of my life, and that my golf was really going to take a, you know, downhill from there. But that's how it happened, yeah.
And what were you trying to do? What are you trying to do?
Well, Well, what I'm trying to do, an organization I'm with now, Seniors for Climate, our goal is to, work for a better world, free from the destruction of fossil fuels for our grandchildren and our children. That's what I'm trying to do, and everything I do is focused on that. We know what the problem is, we have the solutions, now we need the political will, and as a large group, and I can talk about that later, seniors have, and we vote. And it was Bill McKibben who told us in a meeting, and I think Betty was in on that meeting, he said, there's no known way to keep seniors from voting. And he's right, We're going to vote for climate action in every coming election going forward.
Vanessa, you're kind of on the other side of the spectrum, because whereas Rolly, became more engaged a little bit later in life, you got an early start. You started as a teenager, which is uncommon. It's not typical that a person that young would be as involved as you became at a young age. So I'm curious about what your story is. How did you come to be the kind of person who would involve herself in the climate movement?
Thank you for the question. So I am Gen Z, hence we're in a panel.
Stop rubbing it in.
And I just want to preface this by saying I apologize in advance if you hear too many likes and ums, but so in regards to my story, yes, I guess officially I started when I was 16, but the interest kind of grew when I was 10, and it started with a love for animals. For a long time I wanted to be a vet, and so I always had domestic animals at home. I had a hamster, I had fish, anything that my parents were okay with that wasn't a cat or a dog, I would have. So when I was around 10, I think that's when they started adding stuff about climate change to the curriculum, and I started learning a bit more about it, and I got a little bit more fascinated because I think I saw the link between how climate change can affect wild animals. They taught us that a little bit. So I started getting involved at 10. In my elementary school, I joined the Eco Council, and then in high school, I continued that. I joined Eco Council, World Action Council. I was always someone who liked to get involved. And I wasn't too sporty, so I was like, hey, this is at least something I could do extracurricular-wise. Though I did play soccer once a week, so at least I had that. But I think one time I actually attended a fair. It was a sustainability fair, and there was different organizations that operated in the environmental space that were present, and one booth was Citizens Climate Lobby Canada. And at that booth was Kathy Orlando. She's the director. I call her my climate mom too, because she's been a mentor of mine for years now, ever since I joined the organization at 16. I'm 25 now. So I started volunteering with them, and it really empowered me because the whole organization, it's a grassroots nonprofit, and they empower and train citizens, volunteer citizens who lobby their members of parliament at the federal level and at the provincial level. So I felt really empowered by that. And as I continued my school commitments of being an Eco Council, I also was doing CCL at the same time. I traveled to Ottawa. I lobbied one conservative caucus, actually, at the age of 16. And I got all my peers to sign these postcards from CCL saying how much they care about climate change, how they want to see action implemented by politicians. So that was really impactful. I've continued since, and I also dabbled a little bit in social entrepreneurship as well. So when I was 18, I participated in a hackathon, and at first I always thought, oh, corporations are the criminals, capitalism's the criminal here, this is what's causing climate change. And hopefully at some point in our discussion we could talk about how we can utilize capitalism to better advance our efforts in tackling the climate crisis. But I participated in a hackathon that was geared towards developing a sustainable solution, and I ended up doing something with food waste and biofuels, got really interested in that, and then the Commission for Environmental Cooperation posted an ad saying, oh, if there's any youth between the ages of 18 and 24 to submit an idea to solve an environmental issue, and then we'll give you funding if you win. So out of 167 applications, I submitted something similar to what I did. It had to do with biogas this time, not biofuels, and microanaerobic digestion, and then we won the funding. So we continued to pursue that project, myself and my former partner, while we were in university, and we built a little minimum viable product, an MVP. So I kind of dabbled in both conservation, advocacy, as well as social entrepreneurship, and I still continue those things as I go.
And how would you describe Vanessa Fiore's project? What are you trying to do as a climate activist?
So that's a great question. I think my priority right now, I was just working as a project manager at Lion Electric, and it's Canada's largest medium and heavy duty electric vehicle manufacturer. So because I just graduated from school 2 years ago at least, trying to get my footing in terms of establishing my career, but I want to make sure that the career in which I'm in is well aligned with my values. So obviously being at Lion Electric, we were focused on electrification in Canada, and it's a Canada-born company. So I was focused on that, and I also volunteer on the side. I do a lot of citizen science work. I'm hoping to kind of expand that and maybe create a coalition of young citizen scientists who kind of do continuous monitoring of environmental impacts, because I'm also interested in environmental impact assessment. So anyways, finding a career and then also continuing citizen science and my advocacy is something that I'm working on now.
We know that the global consumption of fossil fuels reached record levels this year. That's terrifying, and it's overwhelming. And I'm just wondering how the two of you, in the face of that, stay hopeful. And would you describe what you are as hopeful?
That is a great question, how to stay hopeful. The way I stay hopeful is by being involved and working actively with, in my case, mostly other seniors. One can actually enjoy or meeting new people and having fun while participating in all of these climate actions. For example, right now, across Canada, on October the 1st, which is next Tuesday, there will be, I think we're up to 76 different groups organizing an event, groups of seniors. And this is on Canada's National Seniors Day. I didn't even know we had a Seniors Day, but does everybody know we have a Seniors? Well, we do, yeah. And I was on the website and checking the website, Government of Canada website, and it says, be kind to seniors on Seniors Day. I mean, help seniors like cross the street or with their, and if you're visiting a nursing home, make sure you give flowers to the ladies. They like flowers. And I'm thinking, what the? And so our project, the purpose of the project is to repurpose National Seniors Day. And we're saying, thank you very much for all those nice things, but what we really want and really need is climate action. So we're having a ball with this, and right now over 27 as of this morning, 2,700 seniors from across Canada have actually signed our mailing list. I mean, that's in 5 months. So that's how I stay hopeful. And just to make a parallel with what's happening in the US right now, led by Bill McKibben, there's a thing going on, movement in the US called Third Act. As in, we are in our third act, those of us who are seniors. And they have about 75,000 new members in 4 years. So I like to do this proportionality test. Like 75, we're about 1/10 the size of the US. So if we had Third Act in Canada, 7,500 members would be an equivalency. It took them 4 years to get that. In 6 months, we have 2,700 who have signed on this email list, this contact list for Seniors for Canada. So there's a tremendous amount of interest and motivation. And as I said before, we vote. So that's what keeps me hopeful. And also the fact that youth and different, it's an intergenerational movement, that youth and seniors can continue to work together. And that's a different question, but I think that's something worth exploring as well.
In the face of those kind of this stark reality, are you hopeful, Vanessa?
Obviously, I have my days where I'm not, like I think a lot of people, but overall, a lot of what Rolly said resonates with me, because one pledge I made to myself when I was 16 and I first joined CCL was, I'm going to do one action per day, no matter how small or how big it is. I'm going to do one action per day to, I guess, alleviate the climate crisis, whether it's signing a petition, whether it's picking up a piece of garbage that I find on my walk, home. Having that sort of, even if it's small, obviously it's just a drop in the bucket, but just that gives me a lot of satisfaction, and knowing that I'm doing what I can, because obviously there's so much out there that we can't control. We can't control what fossil fuel companies do and how they lobby the government, and we can advocate for it, and that's what we're all doing here, is learning ways, learning solutions that we can advocate for as citizens. So definitely taking action. Also, Rolly touched on this a little bit, but collaboration, being in a room with everyone who shares a like-minded passion really gives me a lot of hope. That's probably the biggest thing that gives me hope, is we can't tackle this by ourselves. We need to mobilize collective effort, collective passion, and collective knowledge from all of us, from all different generations, in order to really move the needle and really strive towards change. I think having that sort of collective effort and knowing you're not alone is super optimistic.
And yet I recently had an encounter with a young climate activist, probably in her 20s, and she said basically, keep your hope to yourself, right? She basically said, we don't need hope at this moment. What we need is reality. And the reality is we are hurtling towards the abyss. Those were her words. We're hurtling towards the abyss, and the chances of our saving ourselves are slim at this moment. And people need to know that. People, in fact, need to know how terrifying that is. Is that the message that people need to hear? Or what is the message that people need to hear at this moment?
Personally, I mean, you can compare. I've heard the term used, hopium. It's really a false reality. The reality is much more stark than that. But and what's frustrating for me is the fact that we know what the problem is. We have a climate crisis, but it's really a fossil fuel pollution. It's a fossil fuel crisis. We have the solutions. We can talk all day about what the solutions are, but the real solutions lie in systemic solutions, not in the technical, innovative side of it, because this is happening. But how do we get our governments to act? What we're seeing now, for example, is we're seeing more infrastructure investment. We're contributing to we're adding to the very thing that is making our climate worse. And I'm sure Tzipora Berman will probably address that, because she had a great article, a great piece in I think it was an op-ed in the Globe and Mail some time ago. And we have to stop pretending. We have to stop, these are her words, I believe, we have to stop pretending that we're actually involved in the transition towards renewable energy. We're not. We're continuing to invest in fossil fuels, the very thing that is causing the problem. So we have to get on our politicians, and we have to start electing people, politicians at all levels, who will have a climate agenda. To me, that's the only way.
Vanessa, how do you respond to that young activist?
I see her point. I understand, obviously, when it's right at our doorstep at this point. I mean, we've seen the wildfires out west. It's happening in Canada as well as in other parts of the world. In Florida, there's a hurricane right now. I understand her panic and her reasoning for this mentality, but I don't think that being in a panicked state at all times and sort of yelling and getting angry is really the solution either. I think we need to take a sort of rational approach, along with, I guess, some expressed anger and frustration, but in moderation. I'm not a therapist or anything. I'm not going to advise anyone on how to express that, but there definitely is a level of urgency, yes, and we need to emphasize that. But like Rolly was saying, it's not about getting in people's faces and getting angry and being like, we're in an emergency, which we are, it's true. But it's also, again, call to action, making sure that we have solutions in place and we know where to start. Like Rolly was saying, it's electing officials who have a green agenda. I also think as well, coming from the private sector and working for an electric vehicle company, we really need to support a lot of industries who are trying to electrify. Easier said than done. Obviously, that requires political will to do so, because in the case of where I was working, I was unfortunately laid off along with 300 people because there was not enough funding and not enough subsidies for electric vehicle adoption across Canada. So they kind of work in tandem. And I'm actually reading a book called The Collaboration Challenge, which talks about how private sectors and non-for-profits can collaborate on matters like this and solving issues, and also how it benefits private sector companies. But we need to make sure that, you know, all levels, all sectors are supported, because it's a collective effort, like I said. So making sure we have actual solutions and call to actions in place, not just panicking, is, I think, really important.
Mm-hmm. But I guess the question is, you know, given your experience, Vanessa, how do you best galvanize people, particularly young people, to become involved? Like, what is the best way to scare them? Is the best way to tell them that there is a possibility for transformation? Like, how do you go about messaging that demographic?
That's a good question, because definitely I come from a demographic that already cares, evidently, and I surround myself with a lot of people who care. I find that if you want to reach more audiences who aren't necessarily in those circles, you kind of have to bring up how it is affecting them, and not necessarily in factual terms. I think in the climate advocacy community, we have a very big tendency in always sharing facts, and some people just don't receive it as well as we think they do, or they're just tired of it. They hear it all the time. It's always on the news, it's always on social media. You're always seeing these negative, burdensome facts coming up. I think a lot of what's concerning young people now is, you know, the cost of living, how expensive everything's gotten. So we can further exacerbate, you know, and emphasize things are getting more expensive, because, and one of the factors is because of the climate crisis, right? Healthcare is we're going to be using up more resources in healthcare, and there's going to be longer wait times in hospitals, for example, if the climate crisis, and we're already seeing that, especially with the pandemic, but if air pollution continues to worsen, for example, and it has been out west with all the wildfires, right? So just seeing how it relates to their, you know, I guess in their lives, how it's affecting them, how the cost of groceries are going to get more. I mean, it's because of monopolization of the industry, but it's also because of supply issues. If farmers can't grow their crops because we don't have ideal weather conditions, that's going to create an even decreased supply. And so that's going to increase the cost of our foods. So just kind of framing it in a way, and I think this can be applied to all generations as well. Maybe you could speak on that.
Your microphone.
Sorry. There's a fine line that you have to walk there between, you know, talking about how the impacts of climate change, whether it's on our food supply or personal health and so on, and then yet, you know, mobilizing people to in spite of those problems, continue to work at solutions.
And how do you
Well,
mobilize people?
for example, let's just take the cap on emissions. I should have brought, there are about a couple of thousand emissions caps floating around Canada right now. It says emissions on it, and it's a cap. And we have 1,000 of those right now being circulated across Canada. And so our government promised to do something about an emissions cap. I think it was 2021. So that was delayed. And earlier this year, it was delayed to the summer. Now it's delayed to October. Well, there's an election coming, so if it's delayed one more time, it's not going to happen at all. So this is where, as citizens, we have to be able to exert pressure and speak out on these kinds of delays. That's the new, by the way, that's the new climate denial. Delay. Delay is the new climate denial. And we just keep kicking that proverbial can down the road.
I've heard both of you, in the short time that we've been together, mention politicians and mention the importance of electing the right kind of politician. And I'm curious, given the state we're in, why do you have any faith whatsoever in this political system?
Yeah, it is my turn. I know, that is a good point. I think, well, see, I think one thing we do have to kind of plan for a little bit of an incumbent catastrophe. Why do I have faith in the political system? I think, well, it's a natural, I feel like we do naturally cycle through different parties, right? Like there's, especially in COVID, for example, during the pandemic, a lot of people, I think that's when the mentality towards our current leaders right now kind of shifted, because a lot of the underlying issues, for example, surrounding healthcare, surrounding some of our social services kind of got brought to light. So I think it's only natural that now, as people are getting more fed up with the state of the economy, with the state of our social services, that the needle's going to turn the other direction. I did kind of mention before that one thing, it shouldn't just be, oh, it's the government that needs to act, because you're right. You can't always rely on the fact that there will be elected leaders who do care about the climate crisis and are going to be committed to it. There isn't. We can't control that. The only thing we could do is just tell people you need to vote for who you think is best positioned to address it. But at the end of the day, we can't control the results. We can't control how the majority of the Canadian population feels. But I was talking a little bit about multi-sectoral sort of collaboration. It shouldn't just be, oh, there needs to be the right government in place. And it does influence a lot, obviously, because it influences the amount of funding that goes towards a lot of nonprofit contracts, for example, or it influences the amount of money that goes towards subsidies. But I think finding ways, again, maybe how those two can collaborate, private sector, nonprofit sectors, to empower each other and not just rely on governments, because it is unreliable in a sense of we don't know who's going to get elected and what kind of policies are going to be implemented that can further, enhance or detract a certain industry from growing or a certain change to be made. So I think that is a good point. We can't rely on politics and politicians to sort of solve our issue. It's not just a one-way solution or a one-way thing. We need to also find ways to sort of enhance collaboration.
Can I add to that? Mm-hmm. I think you brought out a really good example. Look what happened during COVID. Governments mobilized and, dealt with that emergency, dealt with that crisis. And for the most part, dealt with it fairly well. We have a crisis which is proportionally, will make COVID look like a Sunday march in the park. The crisis we're facing is existential. Now, we can't rely on governments to save us. Nobody's coming to save us. We have to make sure to put pressure on our governments and get involved and make sure that they deal with the crisis or with the emergency. If your house is on fire, you call the fire department. You don't add fuel to the fire, which is what our governments have been doing. And regardless of which government is in power, no party right now has the perfect solution. So I think we have to keep exerting pressure on our elected officials and get involved.
What gives you confidence? I know Seth Klein has made the argument that this country has done big things before. Yeah. And he cites the fact that during the Second World War, Canada managed to mobilize itself in a way that enabled it to contribute to the war effort, which ultimately resulted in victory. And he said that it was a monumental challenge that this country was facing in the 1940s, and it managed to meet the challenge, and that the climate crisis that we're facing can also be met. Yeah. But do you have confidence that we have the ability to move government to recognize the emergency that we're facing?
I think we will when the emergency gets to a point where it's affecting everybody. And right now, it's not at that critical stage yet, but we will be there. Climate is coming for all of us. There's no question about that.
But clearly, that point would be too late.
It might be too late.
So what to do in order to move faster?
Well, Seth Klein has a lot of good solutions in his book, and if you haven't read his book, The Good War, you ought to. And I know Seth Klein. We've had discussions about this, and he actually just did a clip to support Seniors for Climate project across Canada. And so, I mean, there are solutions out there. We just have to make sure that our governments, enact these solutions or act on these solutions, and that's where we're failing. We have the wrong people in power or the wrong politicians being elected, not the wrong party. All parties are about the same.
Adrian, maybe you could speak on this a little bit, but I was having a conversation with my partner about this. Okay, I'm reading How to Be a Climate Optimist right now by Chris Turner. I pointed there because my book is sitting there. And there was a chapter where he talked about enacting a wartime measure to solve climate change. But then he explained how it would be kind of futile. It wouldn't really work. Because there's just too many conflicting sort of views when it comes to it. So we were talking about the climate strike. And I was saying, I was telling my partner, oh, let's go. He's like, well, what's there? I'm like, there's going to be a bunch of organizations and people striking. And he was like, okay, what are they going to be saying? I'm like, well, they're probably going to talk about their campaigns that they're running. And he was like, okay, so is that even a call to action, really? Like, how are they? Because, and then we were talking about the civil rights movement. I'm not a history buff, but I was like, why? Because he argues that advocacy only does so much. He doesn't think it's as effective as, direct implementation of things. And I was like, well, it's worked in the past with women's suffrage, civil rights movement. He was like, okay, but people in the civil rights movement actually brought the government a document outlining this is exactly what needs to be done in order to, improve civil rights. So I don't know if you know much about it or want to speak to it, but.
Maybe I'd say this, that I think history has taught us that power only responds to pressure, right? Power only responds to pressure. And if we look at some of the more important social movements of the 20th century, those movements didn't come from government. Those movements came from communities. They came from ordinary people. And we also sometimes make the mistake to think that these movements were led by these iconic figures, right? The Martin Luther Kings or the Mahatma Gandhis. And of course it's true that they played a very, very important role in inspiring and played an important role in guiding. But the truth is that often the people were ahead of them, right? And the people were often pushing them in ways that they sometimes were resisting. There were a lot of folks who were much further ahead of Martin Luther King and who pushed him to become more radical than he initially was. So there's probably something to be learned from that, right? That organized groups of people, when they're committed to making change, can accomplish some tremendous things.
Yeah. I'd just like to go back. As I said, I've been an activist for 20 years now or so. And 10 years ago, you almost never heard of news reports on climate. It wasn't mentioned. In 2018 came along Greta Thunberg, and she she started a global movement involving youth, which, well, we can talk about our own little experience on that, but started a movement which has brought climate change to the front burner. Now we're talking about this all the time. It's in the news. It's in mainline media every day. Not a day goes by when there's not something going on. And I think if generations, and of course a continuation of the Greta movement is what's happening right now globally at the seniors level, there is now, so the different generations working together will have an impact on governments. And you're right, government will only react to pressure. So we have to keep the pressure on and increase the pressure.
I realize I didn't give you a proper answer, and I should have elaborated a little bit more, so I will. There was an organization that many people in the room here might be familiar with called SNCC, right, which was a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it was an organization that was led by young people, by youth. Right? In many ways, it was the first kind of youth-led social group of the 20th century. Right? And it was led by people like Bob Moses, who some people here might be familiar with. Who himself was a very, very critical leader. But that group of young people was inspired, actually, and was helped by some older folks who understood the importance of sharing power and sharing their knowledge and supporting young people. And one of those people was Ella Baker, who's someone that, a name that people might be familiar with. But Ella Baker had been a very, very prominent activist in her own right. She was part of the NAACP. She'd been part of all the major civil rights organizations in the 20th century. And she played a kind of a mentoring role at a very, very critical time in the development of SNCC in the early 1960s, and really shared a lot of her insight and her strategies. And a lot of those young people, the Stokely Carmichaels, right, who was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Bob Moses, they talk about how important that older head was, right, in providing them with support and encouragement. And so maybe I'm going to kind of push things in a little bit of a different direction, because sometimes generations misunderstand each other, right? Sometimes there's miscommunication. Sometimes young people don't fully appreciate the experiences of older folks. Older folks sometimes don't appreciate the wisdom and the knowledge of young people. So I'm curious, perhaps I can begin with you, Vanessa. Like, what's one thing or a couple things that people need to know about Gen Z that they don't know, right? Particularly older folks. What are some things what are some misconceptions that some of the older generations sometimes have about your generation? And I'm going to pose the same question to you, Rolly.
Misconceptions. I know there was kind of a narrative about our work ethic, for example. So there's a high turnover rate. I feel like just turnover rate has gotten high in general for across the board, but especially I know, with my grandparents, they find a company and work there for their whole lives versus in my generation, people work at a company for 2 years, then go to a new one. So I think maybe people in older generations might see Gen Z as, oh, they're non-committal, or they don't really stick to things and see it through. And I know that's a sentiment for millennials as well a little bit. I'm Gen Z, so that's one thing. I don't necessarily agree. I think in some ways that could hold true, but I think Gen Z just realizes that a lot of the times who they work for isn't necessarily committed to them. Prime example is me. Like I said, I got laid off from my company and kind of left high and dry. I didn't even get a severance because they found loopholes around it anyways. But I think we just realized, well, why would we stay committed to one thing when they're not really committed to us, versus older generations, I guess, maybe had sort of a more committed stance. But I saw a video of recently someone who worked at 7-Eleven, and he was there for 50 years, and he just got an email on his 50th year anniversary saying, "Oh, congrats, you worked here for 50 years," but nothing else, you know? Like, they're just gonna pay you the same, they're gonna treat you the same, it doesn't really matter too much. Maybe you'll get raises, like a 2% raise a year or something, but nothing substantial. So I think that's one thing. There was something else. Do you want to go, Rolly? We can kind of maybe go back and forth.
So Rolly, what are some things that you think your generation has to pass on to this generation, particularly when it comes to the activist work that they do? What are maybe some things that you've learned along the way that you think this younger generation might benefit from?
I've been involved in the Fridays for Future movement in Ottawa since the very beginning, which was in 2018. That's when Greta Thunberg was coming on the scene. And I remember thinking that I had to do I had to meet a few students. And I'm not sure how Vanessa and I met, but for some reason I remember having coffee with Vanessa and 3 or 4 of her friends at the City Hall cafeteria, and I asked them, I said, "So have you guys heard anything, do you know anything about Fridays for Future?" And it was like, "Not really." I said, "Well, so then we had a conversation about that. And then we did the first Fridays for Future protest, I guess, on Parliament Hill in December of 2018. It was so damn cold. I remember I was wearing a parka, and these students came along with, one of you had like sandals on. What the heck? You're gonna freeze. Anyways, we did this little thing, and then the Fridays for Future kept growing to what it is today. So that was an example of working together at a very, fundamental level. But what I've learned about working with students, especially within the Fridays for Future movement, is like the tremendous energy and how we can complement each other's experience. They bring a lot of, new stuff and technology and so on, and social media. And we're the logistics. They're on the front line. We're the logistics. We have experience, money, and all that kind of thing. So we can.
I should come to you if you have money.
Well, I used to until I became an activist.
What are some things that you've learned from the older kind of activists that you've worked with, Vanessa? What are some lessons that you've taken from them?
Well, I guess kind of speaking to the point I was just sharing, I feel like I didn't conclude it very well. So, full circle moment, because Rolly and I did meet by collaborating 4 years ago. I think it's when you do stay consistent and you do stay committed to something that will, eventually lead to a really positive turnout. Obviously, if there's action by our political officials or there's mobilization of and collaboration between private and nonprofit companies, for example, that they have, people in older generations have a lot more experience in life and in their work, and they've seen what small consistent actions can do. And when you stay consistent to things, right, whether that's in their job or whether that's in their family life, I think that's one message that really rings clear, is don't let fear take over. Don't let people who tell you no take over. It's a matter of do what you feel is right and stay consistent and stay committed to it. And obviously pivot sometimes when you realize maybe that's not the best solution, or maybe this isn't the right path forward, but I still want to get to this outcome. I think just having in mind what you want to work towards and knowing the benefits that it'll bring to you and future generations long term is, I think, something that I've taken away a lot, is the consistency and the commitment.
Okay. No, thank you. I want to open up the conversation to folks in this room and perhaps folks online who are watching. Is there a question? Okay.
I don't know if I can speak. You
Maybe
hear
I'll
me?
come.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take this. Yeah.
Thank you. Laura is asking a question.
How do you feel about electoral reform as a tool to improve climate action?
Well, electoral reform certainly would provide more effective government if we can get away from the first past the post electoral system. Certainly, it would be probably easier to get to the solutions that we're looking for.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be more proportional representation. I feel like the government, and it's unfortunate because that was one of Trudeau's first promises, right? In the election in 2015 was political reform, but obviously it wouldn't benefit his government, so they didn't end up doing it. But I think that would be huge.
It would be huge.
Just want to remind people who are listening or watching online that there is an opportunity for you to participate in this conversation. So we'd just like to encourage you to pose your question in the chat box. Okay, I'm just going to come over here and hello. If you can just introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Rolly and Vanessa. My name is Colleen, and my question, the realization I've come to is there's an incredible sense of entitlement, not just with any particular generation, but the habits, the behaviors of just driving over to the store, loading up the groceries, buying an SUV, the trucks, all that. That for me, we used to have something called participation, that the government, that was before a lot of other things, but that kind of people just, like, I loved your idea, Vanessa, like just do one thing a day. If there was that kind of grounds, like it would also make people feel better and give a little bit of hope and those augmenting things. But entitlement just drives me crazy. Do you have any comments, either of you?
That's a really good point. Thank you, Colleen, for sharing. I think, and actually one thing that I wanted to touch on, so that's a really great question. I don't know if anyone here has heard of the term shifting baseline syndrome, but I think even myself growing up, a lot of our dreams, based on what we see in the media, what our parents strive for, what our friends, I guess, are conditioned to strive for, is we want a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence, a mowed lawn, a car, as much money as we can make, whatever the case. There's a certain standard that we live up to, and it's transpired throughout generations. I think it kind of sort of started maybe with the boomer generation, or perhaps before that, post-industrial revolution at least. And it's still trickling down. It's still what people strive for, even though we all know it's not really sustainable economically now because of the cost of living, but also environmentally as well. And one thing that I wanted to bring up that was we talked about earlier, just in a private conversation, was, for example, mowed grass lawns and how terrible they are for biodiversity, but how it's so normal. Everyone's just like, yeah, obviously I'm going to mow my lawn because that's what my neighbors want, and apparently it looks better for the house. And a lot of the times there are policies within municipalities that kind of mandates you to mow your lawn even though you may not agree with it. So kind of breaking those stigmas. I've seen houses around downtown Ottawa who have beautiful, lush wildflowers in their gardens, and having even ways, if you can hack, around our municipal sort of laws, and if they don't get changed, sort of breaking stigmas like that and realizing actually there's beauty to being eclectic and different. I think is, kind of would help with entitlement purposes and also sustainability as well. But I think people just have this sense of, oh, it's my birthright to have all these things. But it's just not becoming realistic anymore. Like, it's just not. It's just naturally how the world has gotten to, and the cost of everything has gotten to. I can't even fathom buying a house, maybe if I move out in the boonies or something, but not here. So, yeah, I think maybe naturally, just with the way the world is going towards, we'll have that less sense of entitlement, and I don't know.
I just add to that one of the things I find so frustrating is that not more people realize how serious the climate emergency is, and it's pretty well business as usual. And I see that in my own family, my own kids. They've been busy for the last 20 years raising their kids and going through what we all did when we were parents. And that sense of entitlement is out there. You had that, so I want the same thing. And it's hard to change those behaviors. And I have to confess that I do have one of those mowed lawns. But, you know, I think each of us has, if where possible, can start changing some of our basic behaviors, whether it's the heating system in our house and, you know, driving an electric vehicle and so on, and lead the way.
I'm not trying to be a prosecutor, Rolly, but it's my job to ask you, why do you have a mowed lawn?
Because it looks good, right?
No, but is it the social pressure? Like,
I think
is it the
so.
fact that
I mean, you know, I'm 77 years old, and I've always had, when I've had, you know, my properties, I've always had this lawn. So, I mean, I never even thought of not having a lawn, but
why not?
because it's just part of having a house. It's that mentality.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm right and everybody else is wrong. I'm just, that's one of the things I haven't gotten my head around.
I'm really
to be
not trying to
honest.
put you on the spot. It's more.
No.
No, I really know. But it's more about our understanding how we are all implicated.
Yeah.
Right? And how our own, that we are engaged in behaviors that are difficult to break with.
They are indeed.
And that we need to kind of mine our own interiors, right? We need to scrutinize ourselves and try to understand maybe how we can move in a different direction, right?
Good
So it's
point.
not, it's everyone is involved. It's not just you or any, like, it's everyone.
I got it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a question here, actually, ma'am.
A question and a comment. Talking about hope, I listened to Jane Goodall this week in New York City at the Climate Week, and one quote from her I'll never forget is, "Hope is much more than just wishful thinking." Yeah. So we do need to continue hoping, and action leads to hope. Without action, yes, there might be less hope. I have a question.
And it's a daily practice, is it not?
Exactly. Yeah, not just once a year. I have a question about the Youth Climate Corps. What do you think is, Seth Klein, right, promoted this idea of a Youth Climate Corps, and it looks like it's going to become a reality very soon. And I was wondering if you had any comments about the potential. What do people in a Youth Climate Corps, what can they do?
Maybe Rolly, I know that this is something that you've mentioned before, the Climate Corps.
Yes, I'm familiar with the Youth Climate Corps. This is one of Seth Klein's concepts, and that has been promoted to governments across Canada, well, the federal government. And actually, there are a series of Climate Corps leaders across Canada that he has set up, and we discussed how, as seniors, we can support that program, and it looks like it might go forward. I know it has in the United States, and we should all get behind it.
We have another question here or comment.
Hi there. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Adrian. So I was involved with the organizing for the Fridays for Future March this year. And thank you, all of you who were there or who supported in more indirect ways. I think that we had a really good march this year. It was more active than just sitting around Parliament Hill. We limited the number of speakers, so it wasn't endless speeches, but it was actually very targeted on climate culprits. So it was a good program, and I think it was we got lots of positive feedback from the people who participated, right? And that's really important as an organizer to offer. In terms of the sort of reflection, the one thing that was probably a glaring gap is that we had some coverage from Radio-Canada in French. and we had virtually zero coverage from English media. And I think that there's sort of a logic model where if you ask politicians, so as activists, what can we do for you to make you better positioned, more powerful, more emboldened? And then the politician says, well, you need to organize me a demonstration of broad-based public support. And then if I have that broad-based demonstration of public support, then I feel comfortable advocating and these more radical policies and making real change. So as activists, our job is to put the people in the street and demonstrate broad-based support. And then the media is supposed to take pictures and put it in the newspaper, so then the politician sees it. And the link has gone defunct. So what's the problem here? What can we do better? Why is this? All those questions.
You know, I don't mean to be flippant, but I work for Carleton University now. So that's what I would say. But I do think that it is important to develop contacts within these organizations. Right. That's often how stories are get onto the radio or get onto the TV, right? That if you can get to the producers of some of those programs, so whether it's Ottawa Morning or whether it's All in a Day, that helps, right? And kind of keeping that conversation going. Journalists are very greedy people, right? They're very hungry people. They're always looking for stories, right? And so if you can feed them, right, then that helps. But I think maintaining that communication is important, and if you can develop those kinds of relationships, that can help. That's the advice that I would offer you. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I say something about that? These 76 events that are taking place across Canada, we've had media training, we've hired a media consultant to give us advice, and he used to work for CBC. He was a news producer. His experience is that CBC has a policy, they're not going to cover a protest or a rally of any kind. That's their mandate is not to cover that. Radio Canada does not seem to have that problem, but we've been told don't focus on a protest, have discussions, invite politicians, but they're not going to cover a protest. Is that true?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they wouldn't cover protests. I wouldn't say that. However, I do think it's important to have a story to tell, right? So it can't just be about the demonstration. If there's some way in which you can tie, I don't know, some kind of innovation or something like a hook. If you can find the hook, a way in which they can then tell a story, not just about folks being in the streets, but maybe there's something in addition to that, then that will sometimes move producers.
They had 6 very good stories. They had 6 very good stories during the march on Saturday. Like, what more can we do? Like, I think it's up to the media. If they really want to help with climate change, maybe they need to do a better job.
Here's something that I'll also say. I think it's also important that people who are interested in making change enter these spaces, right? So being the journalist working at CBC who is interested in climate change, right? Like, that's something which...
Infiltrate.
Well, sure.
Is that what you're teaching at Carleton?
Absolutely.
Yay.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the truth is that we all come from somewhere, right? And so I come from somewhere, right? Like, I have a history. My family has a particular history. That history informed the way in which I moved when I was at CBC, right? My parents were activists. My parents were journalists, for black newspapers. So that kind of formation affected the way in which I operated within that space, right? And I think that people who are interested in affecting change need to be involved in media, right? They need to find their way in. I think that's important. And there's nothing you know, I suppose there's this notion of objectivity, right? But the truth is that we're bathed in subjectivity. All of us. Like you can't escape your subjectivity, right? And so we're not above the fray. None of us are above the fray. All of us have mud on our feet, as they say, right? And so that's a reality. So the person at CBC who tells me that they have no politics, I know that's not true. Because everyone has politics. You come from somewhere, right? So that would be my suggestion, that people need to become involved in some of these media organizations. Yeah. Sorry, 5 minutes. And I'm talking too much. My apologies. Sorry.
I just wanted to comment, going back to entitlement, and in a way the lack of connection that this movement might have, that it could maybe develop more of by connecting to people who are poor, or people who are farmers, or people who live in the suburbs, of all the people that I don't connect to easily necessarily, but for example, ACORN, which is a very active group dealing with social justice issues that actually relate to climate change, like rent eviction and et cetera. So I just wanted to mention that. We need to have people from those groups too. I don't know if anyone's here from them.
And that's a good point. Like with regard to CBC, sometimes there are too many people, or rather, there are a lot of the same folks at CBC, right? And a lot of them come from a particular social class, and that affects the way in which they tell stories. And so we need a diverse group of people in these spaces, right? People from different socioeconomic economic classes, people from different ethno-racial groupings. All of that will help to shape the kinds of stories that are eventually told as well. Right, now, true. I think there was someone over here. Oh, sorry, it was you, sir. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It was me, okay. Just, you know, I once worked at CBC, that's a problem. But, you know, there's another way to get at some of these issues. And one of them is you create a prize so that when you have your events, you've had this extraordinary arrangement of well-known people who are trying to choose the best climate change articles and pieces in the media, and doing the reporting and that sort of thing, so that it then becomes something that it's, you know, they're not reporting necessarily on the protest itself, but they're reporting on the quality of the reporting of the issues that the protests were aimed at. So that's something to think about. You know, what other kinds of things can we create that the media will want to report on because important people are thinking about it and doing something about it?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and a really interesting conversation with the two of you. I appreciate it. My name is Jeff Passmore. I have a management consulting firm in the bioeconomy space. Actually, the talk of history reminded me of a comment that an old friend of mine made, which was, history teaches us about the past and economists tell us about the future, only the present is confusing. By the way, Rolly, I will join your group. I hope everybody in this room who isn't a member of your Seniors for Climate or whatever the group is that you have 2,700 mailing list, after it's over, I'll join up. So there was a question, Vanessa, that you were asked, why do you have faith in government? And when you were asked that question, I thought, well, what choice do you have? You know, so, I mean, I agree, though, that we can't rely only on government, but you don't have a whole lot of choice in terms of, you know, either you just don't vote, which I wouldn't recommend. So, you know, that's the system we're in. But in terms of your advocacy, so I've been a public affairs consultant for 45 years or whatever. And when Paul Martin was in the opposition, he was the environment critic, I believe, when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. And I met with him. That was back in the day when you could go up on the hill and, Martin would invite you into his room and the first thing he'd do is pour you a gin and tonic. Those days are way over. But he told me at that time, Jeff, if you want me to learn something, you need to talk to me now when I'm in opposition, because when we're in government, we don't have time to learn anything anymore. So how many people in this room are advocating and lobbying the current official opposition? Because that's who you should be talking to, unfortunately. When Pierre Poilievre is going to win the next election, and he doesn't get briefed on this stuff, you just can't expect any good results. So that's one thing I would pass on to you as an older generation to a younger generation, is don't ignore the opposition. And in fact, looking at the polls today, the official opposition, once Poilievre forms government, is going to be the Bloc. The Bloc Québécois will probably be the official opposition. So, if we have another 2011 under Ignatieff, when the Liberals were reduced to 36 seats, and the Bloc is probably going to win 50 in the next election. So, and my last comment is, sadly, there's just too many people in the world. We're 8 billion, and that has really driven a lot of the problem with respect to, extreme weather events, climate change, everybody moving to. Nonsense? Well, okay, fine, but I think there's just too many people in the world. There's just too many of us, but that means you don't have to agree. Yeah. So in any case, yeah. Oh, and by the way, with respect to the CBC, does the CBC really matter? We don't have common touchstones anymore. When I was growing up, everybody watched CBC or CTV and they read the Globe and Mail. Now, everybody has their own source of news, and in fact, there isn't even an internet anymore. There's your internet, and there's my internet, and the algorithms are all just reinforcing what we already believe in.
That is a very good point.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Sorry. Sorry.
I know, I mean, oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of this. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to respond to that, but I think the most popular morning radio show in Ottawa is Ottawa Morning, and that's on the CBC. So it's relevant to some people, but it's obviously not relevant to all people, and that's fine as well. People have many different choices, and they should be encouraged to continue to listen to whatever they want to listen to. They might not. They probably don't. A lot of my students don't.
I did, yeah.
But some of them do.
I get my news from Instagram, and Facebook.
Yeah. But listen, you should.
And Google, sometimes Google. But
first of all, I just wanted to say thank you both. Thank you both for being so generous in your storytelling. And thank you for sharing your ideas about the way forward in this age of climate change. So thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Susan Tanner.
thanks, Adrian.
Thank you.
And thank you, Adrian. That was a wonderful session. Really, thank you so much. A great host, as we all know. That was fabulous. Thank you.